Okay. All right. So last time we went over, I think, the last model prefixes, and thank God we're through with them. We're done. So now we can move on to a few other things. Our knowledge of Sumerian is pretty good, and it's just patchy in some areas. So in this lesson, we're gonna look at a few things we left behind and kind of fill the gaps. And after that, we'll be good. Okay, so I'm just gonna do this. Very nice, and we can start. All right, let's go back to talking about conjugation prefixes. We have seen a few ones, and I would say the ones that by far happen, and well, the most common ones are e and mu. However, there's a intricacy about the e one. So sometimes e, which is represented with e3 in cuneiform, and this symbol right here, can be written e. Now this has to do with dialects, perhaps, although we don't know much. We don't know much about Sumerian dialects, and that's mostly because Sumerian happens to be a very uniform language, so it's written the same way across all of Mesopotamia, even by other peoples like Akkadians, Syrians, and so on and so forth, and it doesn't really change. So the written language remains 90%, I would say. Well, 90% of the times, the same language without any change. So, but you do have some occasional, I guess, changes, and one of them would be, as I said, the E3 becoming A, which is quite common, I think, in the south. Yeah, no, the north of Mesopotamia, if I'm not mistaken. It could be because dialects are not really my specialty, I admit. But yeah, so if you see an A, you treat it like a E. So let's see a few examples. So we know that the verb do three means to build. So we have E, do, N. Now, N is the first person or second person singular in the model conjugation. So I will build, or I build, or you build, or you will build. And this is again the E3. However, if you see the A, which is this symbol right here, it is to be treated like a E, and they meaning the exact same thing. So E, do, N. I will build. Now change to a structural level. Same thing for ingangane. So nganga is the model form of the verb ngar, which means to place, to establish. So ingangane, e ngangane. They are exactly the same. And well, with that out of the way, I think we can move on. This is quite linear, quite well, not that involved. Just a sound change, well, in the written language. Okay. All right. So now, yeah, we talk about the ah. So we have a few vowels that can happen at the beginning, I would say, of verbs. A few conjugation prefixes that happen to be vowels. So we have e, which occasionally becomes e, and we also have a. Now, we have studied ba, which coupled with the intransitive or, well, passive conjugation forms, well, intransitive, sorry, passive verbs. However, there is another one. There is another passive conjugation prefix, which we call the stative passive. We'll delve more into that in the intermediate course, I guess. But what it does is it basically assumes the same kind of function as the ba. And this too has to do with dialects. I think it's more present, sorry, more present in south or north. I think it's the south though. And again, it's got the same meaning and the same function of the passive in most cases. So let's see this example right here. So kurum ea aamgar. The rations were placed in the temple. So I wrote durum, it's actually kurum, typo there. So kurum is a food ration, and then ea in the temple, being the locative. Aamgar. So again, just like a ba. Ngar, the verb itself. And then we have the be here, which would stand for the directive. So a dimensional prefix, which stands for the locative or the directive case. So it was placed there in the temple. If we had a ba here instead of a it would mean the exact same thing, most likely. 1 second, just okay. A strange noise coming from the kitchen for some reason. Nice. Okay, so moving on. the peculiarity is that when a is placed right before the verb, so when you don't have anything in between, like in this case, the be there, it is written al. Now we do not know why that is, and it's quite peculiar that you add a consonant there at the end. But again, this seems to be the rule. So eren means army. Tur means to be small or to scatter. So this is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, by the way. It's a real sentence. So eren ani, his army, al-tur will be scattered, will be destroyed, basically, will be made small. So you have al-tur here, which is basically a, plus the l, which again is part of the construction. So yeah, by all means, a is to be treated as a stative or, well, a passive, let's call it like that. We'll see more about dialects again in the intermediate course or in the reading group, depending on how it turns out to be at the end. So with that out of the way, we can move on. All right. So we have seen immi. Now we're going to talk about imma. We only briefly mentioned the immi, so don't worry about it if you don't remember. So we have imma, which is another conjugation prefix. It's not entirely clear, although it might have to do with the juxtaposition of ba with ba becoming ma, although that is, again, very speculative territory. I wouldn't say that as a fact. And again, it appears to be used in sentences where there is a medium, a tool being used. So let's see a few sentences. Martu tukul bitar shuktu imman sirshe. Quite a intricate sentence, but we have to get used to that. So Martu would be a people which bordered the territory of the Sumerians, which in English we call the Amorites. So the Amorites, tukul bita, with their weapons, typo here, tukul, the L is missing, shubtu, a outpost, imansirshe. So the verb here would be tsir, which is to destroy, which is in cuneiform is expressed as tsir. Then what do we have? En, and then the she, which is another way of representing esh, I guess. I took this example from a tablet. I did not note down the name, but so third person plural, they destroyed. And since they say with their weapons, literally from their weapons, ima. So we have a medium, a tool they use. And so it appears to be used alongside with mediums and tools, just like weapons and all sorts of stuff. So let's see the cuneiform here. So this will be mar, tu, the determinative for wooden things, jongish, tukul, bita. Shubtu is quite a special one, doesn't happen that often. And then imma, which is this, imma. Imma, an, sir, she, or esh, depending on the reading. Okay. So far we have e, which becomes e, a, which behaves like ba, and imma. So the only really new thing here is the imma. The other ones are like different variants, let's say, of prefixes we have already seen. Nice. So yeah, that concludes it for conjugation prefixes. We are through with them. There's nothing to add. Unless Somarologists find out something new. I'll let you know. Good. So moving on, let's talk about something completely different. So I kind of changed the style of the presentation to make this as clear and plain as possible. So just like in English, you have separable verbs. Well, no, that would be in German. How do you call them? Phrasal verbs. So verbs made of more than one part. You have the same thing in Sumerian. So some Sumerian verbs are composed of more parts. Usually a noun and a verb. Let's see a few examples. Ki ang, to love, literally translating to measure, which is ang, the real verb, oopsie, and the ground, which is ki. So ground, to measure. Igi ngar, to look, or yeah, so literally to place, ngar, and the eye, igi. So to place the eye is to look. Now, Sumerian can only have one direct object, so you can only have one element in a sentence in a particular case. So you cannot say, I measure the ground, you, like I love you. Oh, well, let's just go on. That will become easier in a second. So in most cases, when you have verbs made of more than one part, the first part takes the direct object. If you say, I love, you have to say, I measure the ground. Because as we have seen, the love is to measure the ground, qiyang. So qi here takes the direct object, and then you have the verb, yang. So I measure the ground. So okay, let's go on. If you want to say I love you or like I love him, you can't say ngai, so I, ani, so him, qiyang. You can't say that because qi is already the object. So you cannot use the same case for the second object. So you cannot say, I measure the ground, him. You have to use another case, which for the person class, so beings, animate beings, is usually the dative. So, ngai, I, ani ra, for him, ki, angen, I measured the ground for him, which translates to, I love him. While for the non-person class, it's usually the directive. So ngai, I, oh, this should be smaller. Ur e, dogs, ur being dog, and e being the directive. Ki biangen. So the na here is the dative third person prefix, dimensional prefix. Well, the b here is the locative, sorry, the directive dimensional prefix, which ties back with the e, the directive e. So yeah, you have to resort to another case if you want to do that. And that goes for most separable verbs. Sometimes though, you don't use the directive or the dative. You use other cases or they work in different ways. For example, the verb to place literally translates to place on the ground. So you say kia on the ground, ngar. So since the object on the ground is in the locative, you can use the direct object with external, parts of the sentence, which are not part of the verb. So ngai, I, kurum, food ration in the the direct object, so the absolutive. Ki, so on the ground, I placed. While here, let's see this other example. Ngai, I, za, she, towards you, so with the terminative. Igi, so the eyes, I placed. Eyes being in the direct object, so in the absolutive. So I placed the eyes towards you. I glanced, I looked at you. It's quite a, I mean, it's quite hard. It's one of the hardest things to understand, I guess, of Sumerian, but you can work your way through it with the right explanations. Okay. All right, so we are done with that as well. So the point is, when you have verbs made of more than one part, you know for a fact that more than one case is going to be used, and then depends solely on the verb. Some words use the directive, some the dative, some the locative, some the terminative. It kind of depends by context, and you have to look at I mean, you have to know the verb to know which case is going to be used. So from now on, and when in the exercises I give you a verb, I'm also going to give you the right explanations. I'm going to specify what case it goes with. Okay. So let's talk about intransitive verbs for a second. So we have verbs. We know that intransitive verbs use a separate conjugation, so they're not conjugated like transitive verbs. For example, tur is to be small. We have seen it already before. Ngen, to go. So itur, he is small. Ingen, he went. However, if you use intransitive verbs with the transitive conjugation, so literally, if you say I small you, that takes on a causative meaning. So I make you small, or I make him small, so on and so forth. So intur, if you add the n, the transitive n, unto n, it becomes he makes him small. He smalls him. Or same thing with ingen. Ingen, he made him go. He goes him. All right. And yep, so we got that out of the way as well. Now the last part would be the non-finite verbs. So far we've been looking at verbs which work with conjugations and things. So verbs you can actually conjugate and use as a pivotal verb in a sentence. So they describe the action of the verb. We also have verbs that work in different ways and they're not conjugated, like English going or to do. So a verb that is not conjugated is known as a non-finite verb, which basically cannot be used as the main verb of a sentence, more like an adjective, so to say. However, they can take different prefixes and suffixes. Sorry, suffixes, not prefixes, in most cases, with one exception. We'll see after this. And we have more combinations, so we're gonna take a look at them right now. They're quite easy though, don't worry. So you can have just a verb, and this is known as a dictionary form. Let's say you have ngar, simply ngar. Dictionary form, why? Because, well, even the Akkadians, who had their own dictionaries, so to say, their word lists of Sumerian and Akkadian, they used dictionary forms to write the infinitive form of the verb, like English to do. So to place would be ngar, simply. And it means, again, to place, but also placement. I would say sometimes they act closer to nouns than real verbs when they're not conjugated. Or do three, which means to build, it translates to just to build, or building, construction. Then they can be used with a few grammatical cases, mostly with the directive and the locative. So when you have the verb and the directive, I call this intentional constructions. So ngar e, we know that e, the directive, means like to do for, in order to, just like a dative for non-person class nouns. So ngar e, for placing, sorry, to place, type again, for the placement of. Do e, for the building of, for construction, for building, to build, in order to build. And when you add the locative instead, they're more like temporal constructions. So ngar a, in placement, in placing, when placing. Do a, in building, when building. Although this happens very rarely with the locative. Moving on. you can use them with a suffix, which is sometimes referred to as the maru imperfective suffix, ed, which, by the way, never appears in cuneiform as ed. It always appears as just e, unless something comes after it. And well, when a verb is used with this suffix, it's usually in the maru, but also in the hamtu. So let's see an example. Nga, nga, e. This would be nga, nga, to place in the maru, plus ed, without the final d. And I call this a imperfective construction. Well, after the maru suffix, of course. So to be placed, going to be placed, yet to be placed. Due, which would be dued, to be built, going to be built, or yet to be built. So a future construction, so to say, a future potential construction. Then you have the opposite thing, so a hamtu suffix, so a past action. Ngarra, placed, or dua, simply built, something that was already built or placed. So basically an adjective. So the ed and the a look basically identical to the directive and the locative here. And well, the best way of distinguishing between the two is just looking at the context. Sometimes they're quite vague and it's not entirely clear. They're ambiguous. So it's quite hard at times. And then you have, well, combinations of the two. So you have the maru suffix ed plus the directive. And when you have ed plus e, they usually result in de3, written like this. So nga de or ngarre de. I call this a construction of finality. So because it underlines, it expresses the finality of the verb. So in order to place, for placing, for the placement of something. Do de, so do ed e, to be built, in order to build, for the building of something. Instead, when you have the locative a after the suffix id, this is a potential construction. So ed plus a usually results in da. So ngarre da, to be placed, when placing, if placing. Do da, to be constructed, when constructing or if constructing. It's a mouthful, of course. It's, I think, 6 or 7 possible combinations, but again, they are not that hard, in my opinion, to understand. And that would actually conclude the lesson. It's not much, but again, we know almost everything about, the longs and shorts of Sumerian grammar. So I have a recap here. So we have seen all this. So the conjugation prefixes are done. The dimensional prefixes are done as well, all of them. The model prefixes are done. We have done everything concerning the a. We just have to do the nga, which was in the next lesson, which is also, I think, the conclusive lesson. And talking about broader topics, we have talked about causativity with intransitive constructions, and we have talked about non-finite verbs. So these constructions here. We have talked about separable verbs and indirect objects, and about nominalization. We'll see a few things with sentences in the next lesson. And then, well, we'll also take a look at numbers, question words, and, well, a few other minor topics. And after that, we'll be actually done. So I think, yes, I do have something else. By now, you should know how to conjugate verbs at best, how to use grammatical cases, so how to basically navigate cases and word endings, and how to read sentences and understand mood and, well, aspect and all the aspects of the verb. So in the entirety of Sumerian grammar, so we should know all the aspects, I guess. There's not many of them, just the suffixes and the prefixes, and that should be enough. So this was the last slide, I think. Yep. So I think we can stop the recording, but I do have something else to show you. So